Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City and to our service of worship. Can I just tell you that there's almost no place I'd rather be than in church? I love church. Do you love it? Maybe not as much as me. I'm kind of a nerd for it. If you're visiting with us this morning, you are our honored guest, and we are especially glad to see you today. We invite you to stop by the welcome table just outside this door in Elliott Hall after worship. Let us introduce ourselves and get to know you a little better as well. This morning, as every Sunday morning, we light our chalice with these words today from Judith Quarles. At this hour, in small towns and big cities, in single rooms and ornate sanctuaries, many of our sibling Unitarian Universalist congregations are also lighting a flaming chalice. As we light our chalice today, let us remember that we are part of a great community of faith. May this dancing flame inspire us to fill our lives with the Unitarian Universalist ideals of love, justice, and truth. And now I invite you to rise in body or in spirit, and let's sing together number 113. By this time next week, this building will be bustling with activity after a long and relatively quiet summer. The coffee will be brewing an hour earlier. Religious education teachers will be looking over their lessons and checking their classrooms one last time, making sure they're ready. Families will be herding the kids into the car, bathed and dressed and ready to make their grand entrance at 11 o'clock. Committee heads will have scheduled their first meetings and agendas will have been drafted. The musicians will be back in their paces. The copy machines will be whirring and the tables will be freshened up in Elliott Hall and everything will be ready for a new year at church. But today, we can take a moment to remember what it is all for. What brings us together to this place every week. What brought you here for the very first time? Whether it was a week ago or 30 years ago, what was the question in your heart that could only be answered here? What questions bring you here now? What sustains you in this work we are doing together? Who have you met here who's changed your life? And whose life have you changed? Remember, too, the hard moments, the times when it was harder to know what you were looking for, the times when the work was heavy, the times when you were growing, for growth is always hard work. It is all good. It is all blessed. It is all worthy. Before we begin a new year together, let us remember why we are here, and to what and to whom we are called. And let us imagine what is yet to be formed. When we are together, we are limitless. May it be so. Amen. This morning's reading is from a new book by Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. The common idea of claiming colorblindness is akin to the notion of being not racist. As with the not racist, the colorblind individual, by ostensibly failing to see race, fails to see racism and falls into racist passivity. The language of colorblindness, like the language of not racist, is a mask to hide racism. Our Constitution is colorblind, U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Harlan proclaimed in his dissent to Plessy versus Ferguson, the case that legalized Jim Crow segregation in 1896. The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, Justice Harlan went on. I doubt not it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage. A colorblind constitution for a white supremacist America. Denial is the heartbeat of racism, beating across ideologies, races, and nations. It is beating within us. Many of us who strongly call out Trump's racist ideas will strongly deny our own. How often do we become reflexively defensive when someone calls out something we've done or said racist? How many of us would agree with this statement? Racist isn't a descriptive word, it's a pejorative word. It is the equivalent of saying, I don't like you. These are actually the words of white supremacist Richard Spencer, who, like Trump, identifies as not racist. How many of us who despise the Trumps and the white supremacists of the world share their self-definition of not racist? What's the problem with being not racist? It is a claim that signifies neutrality. I am not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. What's the difference? One either allows racial inequalities to persevere as a racist, or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. This may seem harsh, but it's important at the outset that we apply one of the core principles of anti-racism, which is to return the word racist itself back to its proper usage. Racist is not, as Richard Spencer argues, a pejorative. It is not the worst word in the English language. It is not the equivalent of a slur. It is descriptive. And the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. The attempt to turn this usefully descriptive word into an almost unusable slur is, of course, designed to do the opposite, to freeze us into inaction. The good news is that racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities. We can be a racist one minute and an anti-racist the next. What we say about race, what we do about race in each moment determines what, not who, we are. Yes, this name tag says, hello, I am racist. Please don't run for the doors. I will explain it. Just hold tight. But first, some announcements. And you know there's going to be lots of announcements this time of year because there's lots of things going on. So I'm going to limit it to what's really important for today. And if my friend Amanda Esko were here, she would say the really important thing is if you have children in religious education or know someone who does, please get them registered. We're starting next week, and we want to know who your kids are and how old they are this year and all of the interesting things about them so we can be ready for them next week. With that said, I want you to mark your calendars for 2 weeks from today, September 15th. We're going to try something new. It's an intergenerational potluck after church, where all of the oldest to the youngest and everybody in between is going to eat together on the playground out here. It's going to be magical, and you do not want to miss it. So be here on the 15th for the intergenerational potluck. Oh, bring a dish also. Did I forget to mention that? Third thing, you can mark your calendars as well for September 20th. It's that Friday. This is the first day of the global climate strike. Many of you probably already know about it. Probably some of you are planning to just walk out of work that day. I hope that you are. But our youth are leading us nationwide. If you haven't seen the news, Greta Thunberg has landed in New York, and all of the youth are rising up to join her on September 20th. There's going to be a demonstration at the Capitol, and we're going to do it. We're going to be in it. So watch the order of service and the Torch newsletter for details about where to meet, what to wear, what to put on your signs, whatever. But we want everybody to be there. And finally, I have a praise report. We've been raising money for the next step in Vicky Chavez's legal defense. If you're visiting with us, Vicky Chavez and her daughters live here in our church in sanctuary, and they're always facing legal challenges. But we raised $3,600, if I'm not mistaken, for her legal defense, which is wonderful. Thank you so much, and we'll let you know what happens. In the meantime, you know, we're always, this is an ongoing fundraising effort because she's always facing new things. So just keep informed on that, and thank you for your generosity. I guess that's a good time to ask for more money, huh? At this point, we give you an opportunity to give financially to the life of our church, to greet your friends and neighbors, and especially our visitors on this Sunday morning. Well, this is my first worship service back with you after a long summer break, and boy, is it good to see y'all. I have missed every one of you. And many of you, when I've seen you around the building the last couple of weeks, have said, "How was your summer?" Of course. And "Did you get to go back home?" Y'all are so sweet. If you've known me for a while, you know that I'm from Alabama, and you know how much I miss it. I can't talk about it too much from the pulpit because I don't want y'all thinking, "Oh boy, here she goes about Alabama again. We get it already." But this time I have a good excuse. So many of you know that I guided a group of our high school students to Alabama this summer along with my wonderful co-chaperone, Tim Chambliss. It's always so good to be back home, and I can tell you that the high school students had a good laugh as I stepped out of the airport and took a deep breath of that thick, humid Alabama air and went, "Ah." That was not the same reaction they had, I can tell you. They were more sort of gasping to get a good breath. But we all enjoyed the soft breezes on Lake Mitchell, the thick forests of central Alabama, all those trees, and the sounds of the bugs and the frogs and the jumping fish, things that I've sorely missed these last 2 years. I bow in deep gratitude to each one of you that supported us as we went on this adventure together. All of you who ate chili at the solstice dinner, who bid on items at the students' silent auction and listened to live jazz at their coffee house fundraiser. Everyone who prayed for them and sent well wishes and suggested books and movies for their trip preparation. We could feel all of you with us on that trip, and we thank you. Now, why was this trip important? As I said before, the purpose of the trip was to demonstrate that there is an unbroken line from slavery to Jim Crow right through to today, with mass incarceration and the school-to-prison pipeline. But I especially wanted our students to know, and I want you to know, that the South is not the home of racism, nor is it a thing of the past. Racism exists everywhere in this country, and it is not nearly over. But even more importantly, I wanted them to know that we do not have to sit on our hands and watch it passively. We can act, just as those who came before us did. We can make a difference as individuals, as a church, and as a society. But we first have to decide what kind of people we are going to be and what kind of a future we want for our country. We know one thing for sure. Doing things as we always did in the past is not going to create the future that we dream about. You know how I know that? It used to be enough for people to say, "I'm not a racist." I'm not a racist. It's not a hard statement to make, right? Or it shouldn't be. You would think that would sort of be a baseline for our negotiations, right? If you can't say you're not a racist, then the conversation is over before we've even begun. And yet, we live in a time when the government of the United States, and of many of the states as well, is more overtly, obviously, shamelessly racist than ever before. And yet our president is often heard saying, "I'm not a racist. I'm the least racist person you've ever seen. I don't have a bone in my, I don't have a racist bone in my body." Now, how unique or egregious is that really? What white person in this room hasn't said that? Or at least thought it, right? I'm not a racist. There's sort of a knee-jerk quality to it. But my hunch is that if we asked people of color, they could tell us that they've heard a white person say this phrase even in the middle of doing something racist, probably many times, right? That's why I'm wearing this name tag. Hello, I am racist. Because you know what? Sometimes that white person has been me. Sometimes I have been the person doing something racist while swearing up and down that I'm not a racist. I have said things that were racist. I have supported racist ideas and policies. I have put my money and my vote and my power as a person behind things that were racist. Often I had no idea I was doing it, but sometimes I did. Sometimes my conscience was telling me, Monica, you're being that white lady right now, and it's not helpful. But I went ahead and did it anyway. I'm sure that you can guess that those were some of the more cringeworthy moments of my life. You know how I know? Because the chances are pretty good that each of you white folks have been in that situation too. Either on the giving end, as a white person, or if you were a person of color, you may have been on the receiving end of that. Nobody likes it. Nobody wants to be treated as inferior, not even tangentially. And we all know that no white person wants to be thought of as a racist. Let me just tell you how uncomfortable it is for me to stand in this pulpit wearing a tag that says, hello, I'm racist right now, right? But what we say about ourselves, no matter how loudly or defensively we say it, does not change what we do and the effects of our actions. So if we who are white people don't want to be part of the problem, maybe it's a good idea for us to get a closer look at what the problem really is. We need an updated definition of racism that works for us in a world in which nobody is a racist, and yet we have some of the most racist policies many of us have ever seen. This is one of the questions that followed me to Alabama this spring. As we walked the streets of Selma, I didn't think that much about Dr. King or Bernard Lafayette or the great heroes of the civil rights movement whom we learned about in school. I was thinking about people like Sam Walker, our tour guide at the National Voting Rights Museum. I was thinking about Joyce O'Neill, who sang songs for us at Brown Chapel AME Church, where she has attended church since she was a child. I was thinking about the fellow we met on the last day of the trip at the Enterprise car drop-off, who, when we told him what we'd been doing all week, casually mentioned that he was a foot soldier too. He had been one of the many ordinary people, many of them small children, who threw caution to the wind during those dangerous days in the 50s and 60s and joined the marches for liberation. It is so amazing to be in a place where any random elderly person could be a civil rights foot soldier, a living, breathing national treasure. They are hiding in plain sight, and they're dying now. We're losing this generation of heroes. That's why it's so important to visit these museums and hear these stories and make sure that our younger generations get to hear them too. I also hold a place in my heart for those white folks who came from all over the country to participate in these marches. Ordinary people who dropped whatever they had going on and came to the Deep South to work alongside these foot soldiers. People like Viola Liuzzo, a Unitarian Universalist housewife from Detroit who left behind her husband and 5 children to come to Selma. She didn't have any specialized skills. She just drove down in her Oldsmobile and said, "Put me to work." So she did paperwork, first aid, and some driving. She was shot and killed by a Klansman as she was driving African-American activist Leroy Moton to the airport in Birmingham. Of course, I'm also thinking of the Unitarian minister, James Reeb. He had been an assistant minister at All Souls Church in Boston, but had gotten frustrated with the way the American Unitarian Association was dragging its feet on issues of racial equality. After Bloody Sunday, Dr. King put out the call for clergy persons of all faiths to come to Selma and witness alongside him, hoping that a show of ecclesiastical solidarity would catch the world's attention and put Governor George Wallace to shame. Reverend Reed gathered his wife Marie and his 4 young children together and said, "I have to go." Reverend Reed was brutally beaten by a gang of 5 white supremacists as he and 2 other UU ministers left an integrated restaurant in downtown Selma on March 9th, 1965. He died 2 days later. 4 men were indicted for the crime. 3 were brought to trial and acquitted by an all-white jury. And then a veil of silence fell over Selma that has lasted almost 60 years as white folks without a racist bone in their body closed ranks and decided they didn't want to stir up any more trouble by talking about it. Dr. King delivered Reeb's eulogy in Selma. Here's part of what he said. James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. When I read that the first time, I thought, boy, when Dr. King talks about the murdered by the irrelevancy of the church, which church was he talking about? The Unitarian church? I don't know how that lands with you, but for me as a minister serving this church, it lands like a punch to the gut. For me as a Unitarian Universalist, it lands that way. Is that what Dr. King really thought? Who knows? Maybe he meant the church universal, or maybe he was calling out all white churches. Part of me really hopes that's what he meant. At a distance of almost 60 years, I really want to write that statement off as hyperbole, and yet I can hardly think of a serious person of faith who isn't wringing their hands every day about the irrelevancy of the church in these times. How often do you hear that? The thought that our faith tradition, which was such a firm foundation for Reverend Reeb and for Viola Liuzzo and for countless other Unitarian Universalists who got involved in the movement, could be rendered an echo rather than a voice because too many of us can't get past "I'm not a racist," that will not do for me. Unitarian Universalism must be an anti-racist religious movement, or it is failing to live up to its promise and its principles. Reverend Reeb's murder was never solved. My fellow Alabamians, Chip Brantley and Andrew Beck Grace, have recently completed an NPR podcast called White Lies, in which the mystery of the 5th man is finally solved, albeit too late to bring final justice to the case. Many of you have listened to the podcast and shared it with me. But what's really interesting to me about this podcast is not actually the solving of the murder mystery, though I'm deeply grateful to these 2 Alabamians for all the hard work they did to get to the bottom of the story. What has really stayed with me is the way they wrapped up the story. These 2 white journalists confessed that their own families had been slave owners and Confederates. The families of Reverend Reeb and Elmer Cook, who dealt the final blow, they get together and they talk about what it all means for them, how they're not responsible for what happened back then, but they have to find meaningful ways to go forward. The grandchild of Elmer Cook, a gay man living in New York City, reckons every day with being the progeny of a white supremacist murderer. And he comes to realize that he is not his grandfather. He's not trapped in that story. He is not stuck wearing the badge racist, as Kendi puts it. He can take off that label and choose to be an anti-racist in every moment. And this is where the good stuff is. When we think about being an anti-racist, we might be thinking of people like Reverend or Mrs. Liuzzo, people who laid their lives on the line for the cause of ending racial inequity. But when we think of ourselves as anti-racists, we might wonder if we've got what it takes. Kendi helps us to see that labels like racist or anti-racist aren't tattoos. You're not stuck with it. It's more like a name tag. And when you notice yourself wearing the racist one, you can take it off. And you can put on an anti-racist one. Again and again. Nope, I'm choosing something different for myself today. I am anti-racist. It's what I choose in this moment for myself, for the people I love, and for my vision of the world. Let us go on a little in Dr. King's eulogy. So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike. He says that we must substitute courage for caution. Says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced his murder. His death says to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make the American dream a reality. So he did not die in vain. Being an anti-racist is hard. It requires tremendous humility, for one thing, the humility to admit quickly and unselfconsciously that you're wrong. The humility to recognize that how others see you may not be how you see yourself, and how you see yourself may not be how other people see you. The humility to admit that you may be causing unintentional harm. For people of color, as Kendi points out, the effort to be an anti-racist may require you to examine how you've inadvertently internalized racism that is out there in our society, to realize that it is poisoning you. The racist ideas poison from the inside as well as from outer contact, and to commit to your own healing process. And being an anti-racist requires us all to examine the results of the words and ideas that we are using and the policies and culture that we are creating. Because in the end, it is the results that matter. We have to decide what is most important, what must be preserved at all costs. For me, it's relationships. I don't care as much about being right as I care about being in community. I don't care about the past as much as I care about the future. I don't care about preserving institutions as much as I care about preserving principles. So I invite you to join me moment by moment in choosing to take off the racist badge and put on the badge of an anti-racist, knowing that we start to create the world we are dreaming about by first creating it within ourselves. If we want our church, Unitarian Universalism, to be relevant to the times and the culture in which we live, we have no choice but to be an anti-racist church, an anti-racist denomination, an anti-racist faith. In every moment, we can choose a different story, a different way of life, so that the courageous work of the generations before us will not have been in vain. Amen. Our closing hymn this morning is number 131. I invite you once more to rise in body or in spirit. anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. Amen. There is so much more to say about this trip to Alabama, but the next time you hear about it, you're going to hear it from the students themselves. On September 22nd, we'll have a couple of our high schoolers talk about their experience, and Reverend Tom will be preaching that day as well. So I encourage you to come back and hear more about this amazing trip. In the meantime, enjoy some coffee, conversation, and welcome back.